Hi, welcome to the Chasing Brighter podcast with your hosts, Kelly and
Jessica. Join us on our journey to find the best versions of ourselves. I'm very excited about how my hair looks
great. You know what else makes your hair look great, Jess?
Washing it.
The Warrior Strong Wellness collagen peptides and bone broth. I've noticed a huge difference with just the health of my hair. I just have naturally thin hair. So
collagen's so good for hair, nails, skin. Check out warriorstrongwellness.com for their collagen peptides and bone broth or their multi-collagen protein powder.
If you use the Chasing Brighter code, all one word, Chasing Brighter, you can get 10% off of your purchase.
Hi, welcome to the first episode in our series on healing and coping with grief and loss.
Each month, we sometimes try to pick a topic to focus on in a given month. And it really helps us kind of figure out what kind of guests we want to talk with and the information that we want to share and learn both for ourselves and our listeners. And so September is also Suicide
Prevention Month.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
And so that sort of got us thinking about talking about that topic. And so we wanted to get that topic broadened a little bit more and wanted to talk about grief. Jessica is a therapist and she has some experience and she has a network of colleagues that she's known over the years. And so we've been able to tap into that a bit for this month as well. And also, you know, if anybody who listens to these knows myself, Kelly is a person who doesn't like to talk about sad things. I don't like to feel the feels, which is part of any process. And I certainly don't like to talk about sad things. So when Jess and I talked about what we were going to tackle this month, I was not really excited about this.
You didn't want to do a whole month. You were like, oh, let's just do one episode.
I don't want to talk about sad things. But we are all in a stage in our life where we either have experienced loss or will, or we all know
facing our mortality, facing the mortality of our family members.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And so we felt like this is a good topic to sort of like check in. And, you know, for those of us who have experienced loss or for those of us who know somebody, you know, we wanted to give you guys some more tools and tips on navigating that. Maybe this episode doesn't resonate with you today, but maybe in the future, if you want to come back to it and revisit it, that would be great too.
Right. Yeah. I think we've experienced a lot of loss in our life. And I bring it back to our paternal grandmother was at the beginning of her career, like a teacher in like a one-room schoolhouse. And I remember her telling me that farm kids had a better grasp of the circle of life and death. I don't know if that's why you and I have the understanding that we do about life and death and the circle of life, but I will never forget. We grew up on it. We were raised in our early years of our life on a pig farm. And I remember the neighbor had hunting dogs and them running over, getting out and like grabbing a kitten in front of me and killing the kitten in front of me. I was like 3, right? And then you see kittens being born. And then you see pigs being born. And then, you know what I mean? As you see all these animals like living and dying and going around you, and you kind of understand life has an ending. I don't know. Do you remember all that when we were little?
Yeah, I do. And I also remember watching the pig get slaughtered in the barn or whatever. And that was interesting. But I didn't think about it sad. I was like, whoa, that is weird. I think that it's always been around us and aware. And so even if you think about our maternal grandmother who, you know, lost a child when she was, you know, when I think that was her last child she
had.
Mm-hmm. Yes. And so for the way we grew up, it was always there. It wasn't felt, there wasn't shame around it. It wasn't something that was like swept under the rug. It just was. And so it was very much talked about, even if it was, you know, whether it was a tragic, you know, an accident of sorts, or if it was something that was intentional to like
I think there wasn't
life.
secrets about it. Like grandma had her brother, our paternal grandmother had a brother who died when he was like a teenager, and she talked about Perry and how he died, and she would talk about it. You know, it wasn't like this secret. So our grandparents, we have a Catholic family. That's probably why, all have a lot of siblings. And our grandmother was one of 12. Our parents are each one of 6. So I also think when you have such a huge family, like there's also a lot of death because, like your great great aunt dies or your great grandpa died, or you know what I mean? Like I just feel like people were kind of always being born and dying because the family was so huge. There was like pregnancies and deaths a lot. And we also talked about it, right? We'd process it and talk about it, and being raised. I don't know if Catholicism came in it for you, but like they definitely talked about, we were given a narrative about it, right? By mom. They're with the angels, they're in heaven now, so then you'd feel like, oh, okay.
It sort of felt like you still had a connection with them, even though they weren't physically here. I agree. I think that helps a lot, especially as a child, and sort of understanding that process.
Yeah. And so I think another reason, and we'll get to it, but what we're going to be talking about today, is the grieving process, just the stages of grief and what we think about that, coping strategies for navigating grief, how to support someone who's grieving. And we also, how to move forward and find meaning. And we also want to talk about suicide today. So just to note that this is a trigger warning, and this may be difficult for you to listen to. So please care for yourself and stop listening if it becomes too heavy for you. But we noticed that, factually in research, suicide is on the rise. In my practice, I'm seeing much more survivors of suicide than I ever have in like the 16 years I've practiced. And I know Kelly and I both know people recently and, the last few years who have lost a loved one to suicide, or we've lost people that we know to suicide. So we also want to be able to talk about that today a little bit. What do you think? Like, are you familiar with the stages of grief? Because there's like a million of them, but like lay people not in mental health, right?
Yeah. So no, it's not like I can rattle off, the scientific method pretty well, but like this is definitely not something that is intuitive. I haven't had any education on it, but when I started the research for this month, it's like everybody knows this.
Yeah, I get, and like a lot of things annoy me, but like I remember reading something a long time ago, is that grief is not linear and it's up, down, and all around. And what's interesting is like there are a lot of theories of grief, and we're going to talk about 2. And there are a lot of different people that think of different stages, but the one that people always talk about is 5 stages of grief. And I was aware of it before being a therapist because they're always talking about it in movies and books. But what's interesting is that the 5 stages of grief, right, were developed by this researcher and became famous in her book in like 1969. Her book was called On Death and Dying, but her model was to describe people with terminal illness facing their own death, not about survivors. So I think that's fascinating that now we're like, oh, this is what people go through, but it was really for the people who knew they were dying. So that's fascinating. And those are the 5: denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance. And they do say that this is not about you going through them 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, but I really think that's how it's presented to us and how
I agree.
I think to like grieve linearly.
Yeah, that was one thing also that I noticed was that really, and maybe that's just how we've evolved as a society to know that, you can't, everyone is different. This process is very personal to each person. And so you can't just put names on everything and assume it's going to apply to everyone. And I think this is that. The other thing I was going to say, though, is for a vast majority of us, the way we can understand a concept is to have some sort of mental model, right? A framework. And so I think the great part about this is it provides a framework for sort of like understanding, right? And coming to terms with this process.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think you can, like, if you were like, oh, this person passed away and I'm super pissed about it, something must be wrong with me because I'm not sad. Then you can understand like, oh, there's all these different feelings I can have, and that's okay.
Yeah. Because it's more important to feel the feels, Jess.
Right. Yeah, that's right. It is. Feel the feels. And I think like a lot of people don't get to acceptance, you know?
I think it's interesting that you said that this was really kind of about a person's process and sort of their own mortality, because that's really,
Yeah.
it is hard. I
Makes
think,
more sense that way.
yeah. And also, I haven't been faced with that, but like I remember um, even one of our aunts who passed away, where I feel like she was very much accepting of her mortality and was ready to go. And I was like, wow, how could she do that? I don't want her to go, you
Mm.
know?
Aunt Jane.
Yeah. Yeah, that was really hard.
Are we gonna cry? I can tell.
Mhm.
I'm gonna start crying because you're gonna start crying. I'm not gonna cry. So
Okay.
yeah, when we had an aunt who had we were close to, and she had like stomach issues, and it was like stomach cancer and you're dead, right? I mean, it was just very much like
It was very, very fast.
in
Yeah.
6 months. And at first I felt like she didn't want her quality of life to go down, and it was definitely like terminal, like there was just nothing that they were going to do. And so she had wanted to not go through like all the treatment because the treatment can be terrible, right? It's like killing everything in your body. And I remember writing her this long letter, and she wrote me back. Who knows? I don't want to know where it is. But I feel like she was definitely, you're right, like an acceptance. And because she was an acceptance, that was so helpful to her family. And I
Yeah.
think that it goes back to that narrative. Like when I see people who have survived a loss, I see a lot of people much later in life who lost a parent very young, and then the whole family dynamic changed. And they
Yeah.
never had those end of life conversations. They never had those conversations of like, it's okay, you're going to be okay. And talk, it was like, no, we were in, like, that person was in denial if it was an illness and didn't talk about it and then allow for closure for the family, or it was like a sudden tragic situation where no one talked about it
Yeah.
again. So I definitely think community, like talking about it, is key to healing, right? You got to feel it to heal it.
Yeah, absolutely.
And then I don't know if there's anything else you want to talk about the stages, but like my favorite that I found, I didn't come across this until 2021, is wordings for tasks of mourning.
Yes.
So I like the tasks much better. And maybe that's because I like to check boxes on lists. So I'm like, oh, I can check my task. But psychologist J. William Worden, he provides a framework of 4 tasks that help us understand how people journey through grief. And he says the tasks are in no specific order, and you can go back and forth from one another over time. And the first task is to accept the reality of the loss. So it says, like, for example, the reality may begin to set in immediately after the death, when you must call the mortuary, attend the memorial, or pick up the ashes, right? But like integrating the reality of their death means like kind of taking it in. And task 2 is to process the pain of grief, that grief is experienced emotionally, cognitively, physically, and spiritually. Because you know how people are like, oh, get over it, you've got to move on. But like we need to support that this person is going to be processing the pain of grief for an undefined amount of time. The third one is to adjust to a world without the deceased. External adjustments, taking on responsibilities, learning new skills, internal adjustments, adapt to your new reality. I think about when Grandma Martin died, we were not living near her. And so it took me a very long time to adjust to her not being there. You'd pick up the phone and want to call, or, you'd be like, oh, let me tell grandma, or blah, 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 grandma. And it was like, she's not here. I feel like it took me a couple of years because I was not seeing her every day.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So you weren't faced with it every single day she was gone.
Yeah.
You'd be like, every couple of weeks I'd want to reach out. And then you'd be like, oh yeah, she's not here anymore. Task 4, to find an enduring. And when I say she's not here anymore, I do believe her spirit is around. And that's one of my narratives and beliefs, is that, we can kind of feel and connect to our loved ones. Like, I think they can still kind of be around. Would we talk about, did you read The Lovely Bones?
Yes.
I loved, and that's what Corinne said, like did you like
really
that
great
narrative about
book.
what happens to us when you die? Did you like that narrative? I totally took that on into my belief system.
I think that's a wonderful book. I read that one.
I read it way before I had kids.
Well, I think,
now.
I mean, I read that as soon as it came out, and it was back in the day when I started reading again because I really hadn't read. Well, I shouldn't say again, when I started to love reading.
Yeah.
But that is a great book about that. I think it became a movie, didn't it?
It did. Okay. So, spoiler alert, if you want to read The Lovely Bones and have not, go ahead and fast forward the next couple minutes. Yes, Kelly, it was a movie that came out after I had kids, and I watched maybe 5 minutes of it and I
And you're
started
like, I
crying.
can't do it.
No. So, in The Lovely Bones, first chapter, the 12-year-old, 13-year-old daughter is murdered, sexually assaulted and murdered. And so the book is from her perspective, watching her family grieve. Right. So it's how the whole family grieves, how the mother grieves, how the father grieves, how the sister grieves. And so for her, she was like working for them to see her. She was obsessed with them being okay because the family fell apart after her disappearance. And so she was like trying and focusing so much that, to me, it kind of explained ghosts, or like how you could see someone, because she wanted them to see her and she would kind of move things.
Mhm.
But then these other people from the afterlife were like, come with us. And it was like, if she wanted to move on, she'd have to let go. And it was like, she didn't want to let go of what, because she wanted to watch her family and make sure they were okay. And so it was like kind of also her journey of being able to let go and move on. And so I took that on immediately and was like, okay, that's what happens. That makes sense to me, that people can come and visit and make sure we're okay. But sometimes they have to move on. Sometimes they can kind of become spiritual guides or angels or whatever you want to say. So anyway, Dr. Crean, who we're going to have on the next 2 episodes, Dr. Crean Cherrick, who is a chaplain and grief counselor, really recommends that book if you kind of want to understand. So anyways, we're recommending that. I know I went off the rails, but then just going back to the tasks, task 4, find an enduring connection with the deceased in the midst of embarking on a new life. So, that could be like, having what do they call that for Mexican culture? An ofrenda, where you have pictures and candles, that like an offering place. Different cultures have photos of that person.
When our grandpa passed away, they did a scholarship fund. For the high school. Some people start charities, finding a way to celebrate their life in an enduring way. Right? Like that.
Yeah. And also I think about our mother has like her father was a POW. So she has this whole wall set up of her parents' photos. And so I think a lot about like photos, or a connection can be like praying to that person or thinking about that person, or like you said, a memorial of some sort, but like finding a way to connect. So those are kind of the griefs. I liked the tasks more. There are, if you are interested and none of those feel right to you, there's so many. I encourage you to go and look and see if there's one that kind of feels good to you. But just to summarize, the grieving process, it's unlimited. The time is unlimited. It's not 48 hours like your work gives you 2 days off and then you have to be over it. It can take years and years, and that's okay. That's normal. And it's up, down, and all around. 2 steps forward, 1 step back. It's all over the place, and that's okay. And that's all normal.
Yeah. And it's very personal. And I think that's the hard part, even when we have, when we know people going through things versus ourselves, is because it makes it even more difficult to support them, because it is so personal and it's hard to really know how everyone experiences it a different way.
Right. And so it's like, how do you help someone? And I always think with anything, right? Like, listen,
Yeah.
Like, be a good listener.
Yeah. And I think, one of the things when you are kind of coping with grief and trying to navigate that process, and we'll continue to kind of talk through even some of those tips and strategies, is that, this goes back to when you're challenged with anything, you got to do the work, whether it's even just Googling and doing some research and figuring out what resonates with you, listening to a podcast or a book. But let's go through those coping strategies, Jess.
Yeah. Well, that's kind of what we're talking about at the beginning, is just like when you talk about helping someone, it's like seeking support from others. And that can include a support group and a clinician or therapist, or that can just be your loved ones or your friends. But like, making sure that when you're caring for yourself, you're not isolating.
Yeah. And I have a friend who just lost her mom, and she was talking about that she joined an online support group and just really finding that that's really helpful for her. And I think a lot of people may not it's even taken her months to even realize that she's still grieving. Like it's not something that, just a couple weeks it goes away, and knowing how to kind of continue to sort of cope with it and address it in a longer term way.
And I think about it and I need to tell this to Teresa, who's been a guest on the podcast, but Teresa lost her sister.
Yes.
We lost Mary this year. And she said, I'm having a really hard time. Like I'm having a really hard time moving on, almost like something was wrong with her. You know what I mean? Where it's like, I just can't get past this. It's like, hello, it's still, you know what I mean? It's just been a few months. And I just think our culture, again, thinks it needs to be, let's go through the 5 stages of grief. That's take about 5 weeks and you'll be ready to go by week 6. And it's like, no, all of us take a long time to adjust to a world without a loved one. And that's where it's good to reach out to others. And I think too, as always, I think like with everything, can you just say like a go-to strategy for every single thing ever is to practice self-care?
Self-care. Yes. Well, yeah. Yeah, I mean, it's part of our own like homeostasis of our body, right? Like it's a biological and mental, whole mind, body, soul is self-care, right? We always have to take care of ourselves, and be conscious and mindful of that, especially when you're grieving.
Absolutely. And so I think that includes, mind, body, spirituality, right? So like for your body and your mind, sleeping, that you're eating, that you're moving your body, all of those things.
Mm-hmm.
And I think like expressing and releasing emotions.
It's feeling the feels. That's part of it, right? You have to go through that process.
Yeah. And so that can be journaling. Again, talking to others, giving yourself time to cry. My partner, it's really interesting, doesn't seem to be really emotional, but I was going through a tough time and he was like, well, are you setting aside time to cry? And I was like, I don't know what you're talking about. And he goes, I will go in my car and I will I will give myself time to cry and I will make myself cry to help me through that. And I was like, because I think like, although I talk about emotions and feel emotions, when it comes to me experiencing something very deeply, I compartmentalize it and lock it away and just act like I'm fine. And I have not given myself the space to really process things. So that was really interesting. So I was like, I would journal and I would sit there and I'd make myself cry because that's how it's feeling, but it's so locked away. Sometimes for us, it's hard to tap into. So I thought that was cool advice to like give yourself a space and time and quiet.
Yes.
Where you allow yourself to just let it out, Do you do that?
I do, Jess.
Yeah.
And really ever since I started going through therapy, where I learned to feel the feels and not neglect my emotions, where like now if I feel an emotion, I just let it go, or I know I need to let it go, because I know I have to go through that process. And I've even really been trying to, I do that even in front of the kids. If something is happening or whatever, I'm upset or something, just to go through that. And I've even learned with the kids, right? Like when they process emotions, just getting in that habit of doing that, because you need to kind of get through that. And it is amazing, right? After you have that crying episode or whatever emotion you're going through, you feel so much better.
that catharsis, right? That release.
Yeah.
I also think like I love you're the one that brought this to my attention. And I know we read it in a book, but anyways, like Tara Brach talks so much about the RAIN method. And
Yeah.
to me, I
Yes.
like that investigate piece, which so to me, I could recognize it, right? I could allow it, but then, maybe move on. But that investigate of kind of like, well,
Why am I
why
feeling
am I
this?
upset? Where's that
Yeah.
coming from? What's that about? And then nurture that. I like those last two steps, which I think are important too, because it can be like we can grieve all kinds of things, right?
Yeah.
Like, hi, we're in
Doesn't have to be
America. There was just 10,000 shootings in the last 48 hours, which are
Well,
horrible.
what about the fires in Maui? I mean, the
Yes,
loss of like
yeah,
losing
right.
everything you own.
Yeah. And then that might be triggering. You might not know. And you're like, what the hell's the matter with me? I'm crying about these people I don't know in Maui. And it's like, investigate that. What's that about for you? Is there some fear there? Is that just because it's a human experience and you're feeling empathy for those people?
Yeah.
Like, what are all those feelings about for you?
I did cry with the kids when I was talking about the fires in Maui, by the way.
Well, so anger is a secondary emotion preceded by pain or fear. So out of fear, I'm fucking pissed about the shooting in North Carolina yesterday because a video came to me and I sent it to
Jacksonville?
you. No, Kelly.
Oh, so many.
You're
I'm
the
sorry.
wrong shooting.
You're talking about
Kelly.
the
No,
grad
I'm talking
student.
about a guy who legally got an AK-15 or whatever the hell, I don't know, guns, but an automatic rifle at North Carolina on their first day back at school at the campus and killed a faculty member. And the video was like the college students jumping out the window. And I just like saw my kids like jumping out a window and going to college. You know what I mean? Like,
ain't no thing. Let me
like
just avoid the front door. Yeah.
That wasn't a thing that like we were fearful of when we went to school, and so like I'm angry telling my children instead of like crying. I wasn't crying telling my children. I was like, well, there's another guy with a gun. Here we go, kids.
And did you take UNC off Gabby's college list?
No, but I'm like, I don't want her to go to a school where anyone's ever heard of. So maybe they'll be. I'm like, what's the best? I'm going to have to look at a map of what college is best for you not to get killed. Okay, by someone shooting you. That's a new map I'll be creating. All right. Again, we've digressed. So another way to cope with grief and loss is establishing like rituals and remembrance. And so we already kind of talked about that a little bit, right? Like, and also mom does, our grandmother passed away in 2015, and our mom and our aunt here like to go out on her birthday. Our grandma was a Coors Light drinker. And they'll go have like they found like a little bar or our grandma's name was Viola, and it's called like Viola. So they've gone there before to have a drink and, have a beer for her, or, like there are things you can do to celebrate and memorialize them on the day they passed away, on their birthday. Like we've talked about earlier, here, you can do name a bench, name a tree, put something in their namesake, again, a scholarship, all kinds of different
or
things.
A ritual of something that you might have shared with that person that you did regularly. And, you may continue to do that in a different way. Yeah.
Like when we just talked about Mary passing away, when we went to San Diego with our girls, Teresa and I drove to the campus. And so we drove around and Teresa would talk about, oh my gosh, I remember taking Mary here and here. And, just opening up a space to allow her to remember, all of those memories of her, so anyway.
And the final one, which I thought was really helpful too, is finding an outlet for your grief. So part of the, when you're going through the grieving process is grieving and grief, it's energy. And so that's energy that you can invest in another activity or outlet to help that flow, to help that get released like any other emotion. And so, maybe it's picking up a new hobby. Maybe it's, it's kind of like being mindful of what that outlet is and using it. Maybe it's coloring. Maybe it's, taking a class. It just,
I like that you call it energy, because I think about that kind of hierarchy that that Dr. Turek sent. She had already sent to me previously that I can show you at some point and send it to you. But basically, like, right, if you think that, you know, we're all made of energy, everything's made of energy. There's energy all around, and when you're doing the work and, you know, feeling really great and meditating and doing the things, you have a higher vibrational energy. But when you are in grief, you automatically drop down to a low vibrational level. And so I also think it's kind of like, if you think about that, what are some outlets or things that you can do to help raise your vibrational energy?
Yeah. Yeah.
You know?
And it also kind of, you know, I think these are all really good and interrelated, because I think also part of that can turn into a little bit of self-care too.
Yeah. 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 And I think just going back to, and we talked a little bit about it, but just what do you do if someone in your life is grieving and are you grieving together, and you want to look at how to support them? I don't think it takes like a lot. I just think like a couple of things. And like we said, is just listening. Does listening mean talking? No, it means asking questions, summarizing. You know, you sound like you're really struggling. You want to tell me about it?
We have 2 ears and 1 mouth for a reason, Jess.
Yeah.
We're meant to be listeners.
Yes. And I think not saying, I know how you feel. Right.
Yep.
Being very careful. So, because we make it about us sometimes. Like, oh, I remember when my brother died. Let me tell you about this story. And it's like, no, then you're making it about you. Right?
I agree. And this part, you know, we wanted to kind of cover this. I did some research on it because this to me is the hardest thing. I really clam up when it comes to helping others. I don't know what to say. I don't know what to do. And, you know, there's always the give me, I'm sorry for your loss and moving on. And, you know, it's trying to figure out like what to say, how to say it. And in some ways, it's just about listening and being there, right? It's also hard when, so it's when you have people who you're close to, like my husband just lost an aunt, and so my father-in-law just lost his sister, right? And so it's different when it's that versus, you know, somebody who you're not really, really close with, but they've been going through a loss, and, you know, you don't see them enough and you're not sure like what to say, but you want to say something that you know that they care. And I think one of the things when I was doing this research is sometimes when people are going through a loss, it's important to say, it is important to say the right thing and not the wrong thing, just because they are hurting and they're going through pain. And so just being conscious of that and mindful and thinking through, you know, what you want to say and how you want to say it. I think a great one is, you know, I don't know what you're going through, but I'm here for you.
Yeah.
Is really valid. Right.
And I think like, Teresa is so good at this. My friend Teresa is so good at this. And so I take a page out of her playbook. But like, I think I have gotten stuck in analysis paralysis before because I want to do something big, or I don't want to bother them, or I don't. So I'll say like, let me know if you need anything, which then I found out I was doing something. It's like, that's putting something on their plate. Like if I say, let me know if you need, then that's a task you have to do. You have to let me know. And so just do like an act. And so like, you know, a card, send a plant, send a text, you know, just reach out, anything, just to send a text. I'm so sorry to hear about that. You know, I'm thinking of you.
Yeah.
I know means a lot. And I thought it was cool. I thought this was so cool. So when Mary passed away, I was like, okay, I've got to do something. Because I'm not going to be stuck in this analysis paralysis. And then it's 3 months later and I've done nothing, which I've definitely done before. So I was like, I'm going to go get like a coffee for Teresa. And I'm like, because at first I didn't want to bother her because she lost her sister and it was terrible. But then I was like, no, she needs me there. You know, it's like, what do you do? What do you do? So I was like, I'm just going to push I said, because she said like, I think she was like worried she'd just be crying all the time and in pajamas. And so I was like, well, I'm coming over. I said, I'm dropping a coffee off if you want to open the door and let me in, you can. If not, don't open the door. And so she's like, of course you can come in. You know, she's like, I'm a mess, blah, blah. But anyway, somebody had dropped off like Einstein bagel, like a coffee carafe and like a thing of bagels and just put it on our porch. And I was like, that's so smart.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Just like dropping off a plant, dropping off. And then the reason I love a plant, I personally love a plant, is when our grandma passed. My grandma was a huge plant person, our paternal grandmother. And so I got all these plants when she passed away because she got so many. We divvied them up between everybody.
Yes.
And then I had that plant for years and years.
Yes.
And that was like a remembrance and memorial of my, you know, of my grandmother. So, you know, a plant, flowers, a card, drop off, you know, whatever, like, you know, just drop off a card, just go to their house, stick it on their porch, the end, mail a card. Like we had a member of our softball family lost their grandfather. And we were like, okay, let's just get a plant. You know what I mean? Like very quickly, what are you going to do? Okay. Found a plant, and it was cool because this plant had like an ornament or something. So it was like a little remembrance thing, you know, a beautiful little thing. And then it's like, hop on, get the plant, send the plant. You know what I mean? Like then you feel like, okay. And to all those people who received those things, they have given feedback that was very special to them. That they really, it wasn't like, oh, you just said sorry for your loss. They were like, that meant a lot, that you recognize that I'm grieving and recognize something happened to me.
One of my friends was at a memorial for her brother in Denver, and I wasn't sure what to do, but I wanted to do something. And so I didn't want to get a plant because it was more like a party. It wasn't an actual service. And so I really just kind of racked my brain around something, and I wanted to do something while she was there. And so they were staying at an Airbnb, and they do Instacart. And so I ended up having like toiletries delivered, like lotion, shower gel, body scrub, just a little bit of like a pampering thing.
Right.
And I felt, I didn't know what to get her, but I didn't want to send food because I'm sure they had already bought food. So it was like all these things. I was like, what do I do? And she really liked that. And it worked out fine. And it was nice because it was Instacart. So I did it. The other part too is planning. Right. So sometimes I find myself where it's like the day of, I need to like, oh crap, I need to send something. And so figuring out ways to be creative on what you can get.
But I think that's where sometimes I got stuck on trying to be creative. And if you would have just sent a banana bread, you know what I mean? It's just like,
for sure.
We do want to be creative, but it's like, just again, like if you're just like, all I can do is send a dozen donuts, that is, the feedback I've received from anybody who's been grieving felt supportive. For me, same thing. Anybody that has reached out to me when I've been grieving, that's been really special to me. I'm a person that doesn't want to like host company when I'm grieving. But it is very special to me when people text me to recognize, you know what I mean? Like, I mean, you and I each had a miscarriage. Right. I don't want to host a party and talk to anybody about it. I mean, I'll share that I lost a baby, but I don't, you know, but it was like, I had a lot of friends reach out and just send a text. And that was really special to me, you know?
Yeah.
Any special things in the way that you've received support while you've been in grief?
I really like, one of the notes was just, what can I do to help? Which I know we talked about, but sometimes I think it's really letting people know you want to help them, whether it's big or small, that you're just there to help them out. And it might be just grabbing some sour cream at the grocery store or whatever that is, but something that you really feel like you're kind of helping them get through their days.
Yeah.
You know?
And I think it's like, I needed people to watch the kids. And I think it's like, if you want to tell people to do something, like we'd do it. If you told me, hey, I need you to go grab whatever. I'd go do it for you. Yeah. And I think anybody would, so you don't need to have feelings about it. Just, it's okay to be vulnerable and ask for help. I think, you know, to kind of summarize with talking to experts on grieving, one of the things that we found that is very powerful to help people through the grieving process and helping them to move forward is finding meaning from the loss.
Yes.
You know, and One way to find meaning, like we've talked about before, is connecting with others who've experienced similar grief. Sharing your stories, thoughts, and emotions with others can be very healing. And like you said, your friend that joined a support group, that was very healing and helped them find meaning in it. And I think sometimes we won't know till later, but like when we talked to Dr. Cherrick, it completely changed her career and her life.
Yeah.
And everything that she does. And so think about the hundreds, if not thousands of people she has supported through grief because of her own loss. And I think that it helps us rediscover or discover our own personal strengths. It helps us rediscover sometimes it's a transformative journey that requires introspection that kind of changes the trajectory of our life.
Absolutely.
I think grief, when we are ready to really embrace moving forward, that is when we are able to find a new sense of purpose, and finding ways to make the presence of the loved one felt in our daily lives.
Yeah, and I think that purpose and finding that purpose, there's hope.
Yeah.
Too. And I think it can be really hard because you don't know how to move on, and it's hard to move on. And there doesn't need to be a timeline for when to move on. But when you are ready to sort of rediscover that purpose and renewed hope, it will be there.
Yeah. Yeah. I think we saved the most difficult subject for last, and we wanted to talk about suicide. As we said in the beginning, people dying by suicide is on the rise. And so we wanted to talk. I think what is helpful for me is I found this awesome sheet. It's actually from the state of Nevada on kind of like just how to talk about suicide. So I want to address that. But first, I just want to say so a couple things.
Tell us. I want our listeners to hear your point of view on this.
Okay. I have been working with survivors of suicide a lot since 2020. And so instinctually, I'm like, suicide, must be up. Right. And so then I'm looking at the data, and it is. And when I am working with survivors of suicide, like guilt is so heavy with survivors. And so it really pisses me off when everyone all over the place is giving tips on how to prevent suicide. Even this month was Suicide Prevention Month. It kind of like pisses me off because then it's kind of like reinforcing the family members who survived of like, I should have done this. I should have known. I should have known. I should have done this. 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 And so it reinforces like, here's a list of the 10 things you can do to prevent suicide, because ultimately it is that person's choice to end their life. And I understand that we want to like have a sense of control, and say like, oh, these are the things to look at, but it is not helpful at all for a survivor to read a list of 10 things I should have done. So that annoys me. But I do think I only want to talk about like the one thing I just want to talk about is that it is a myth that talking about suicide or asking someone if they feel suicidal will encourage them to kill themselves. Right. So there's this fear, like, I'm not going to talk about it or they're going to kill themselves. But I think we should be very straightforward and ask if there was someone in our life who is possibly suffering from depression or acting in a way that has you concerned, to just say, are you having thoughts of killing yourself? And just being blatant and ask them about it, But I think it's such an incredibly complicated issue that I just don't think it can be simplified. So let's say you have a member who says, yes, I do want to kill myself. Right. Well, I'm sorry, you're a lay person. What the hell are you supposed to do? Right. And I mean, you can encourage them, like, let's go talk to somebody. Let's go to the hospital. Let's go have a therapist. Let's go do this. But if they're an adult, I mean, what are you going to do? Drag them kicking and screaming? And then you don't even know they lie to therapists. People lie to the therapist all the time and then go kill themselves right after the therapy session.
So, Jess, would you say that again, going back to all of this, where we talked about all these mental frameworks, all these things, if this, then that, when we talk about suicide, it's not linear, it's
Right.
impossible to
Yes.
know.
Yes. Every single survivor of suicide I have seen has been a completely different story. Completely different. And maybe there is this percentage of people who die by suicide, who do A, B, C, D, E, but that's not anybody I see. So, the survivors that I'm saying. Um, and also just another myth, just be careful, is there are people who maybe talk about suicide a lot, and so you think, oh, all they do is talk about killing themselves, so they're not going to do it. Um, that's not true either. Talking about it can be a plea for help, can be a late sign. And so those who are at risk, right? I would just, encourage you to connect them with people. But what I would rather talk about today, instead of like the 1, 2, 3s of prevention, which is just annoying to me, whatever. I'm sure I'll piss a lot of people off, but is just to kind of talk about how to talk about suicide. So I think what I found interesting is that we are not wanting to say commit suicide anymore.
It's well, and also I think there's such a stigma culturally about shame, embarrassment, like something about this act that for a lot of families, it's like something they don't like to talk about.
Well,
right?
Because when you say commit, it's like a crime, right? Like you committed this crime and it's selfish,
like it's
and
bad,
it's a choice or whatever.
Yeah.
But like using neutral framing, like died by suicide, death by suicide, or lost their life by suicide, helps take away the shame and the blame. So I liked that.
Yeah.
Also, another way to say it, which is, I think, interesting, is like, we said it already, died by suicide, or if a person like survived a suicide attempt or lived through a suicide attempt, instead of saying unsuccessful suicide or failed suicide. Because like a notion of successful suicide is inappropriate because it frames a tragic outcome as an achievement of something positive. So, or, be matter of fact, it's fatal or non-fatal. So I thought that was interesting. The other thing, so we said suicide's on the rise, right? Or suicide is increasing, and you don't want to say it's a suicide epidemic or that suicide is skyrocketing because it sparks panic. It makes it seem like suicide is inevitable, or more common than it is. So I thought that was interesting. What are some of the ones that you saw that were interesting?
Well, I think using the word suicidal is not
not
necessarily
because then you're like defining that person by their experience. Like they're more than just this little sliver of their thoughts. So it's by saying like so-and-so is facing suicide, is thinking of suicide, is suffering through suicidal thoughts. So that's interesting. And that goes into just more mental health stuff on saying, instead of saying so-and-so schizophrenic or they're bipolar or they're mentally ill, you can say people with mental illness, people living with schizophrenia, people experiencing bipolar, and so instead of just like defining them by that thing. So go ahead.
Yeah, no. And I think because as a society, we're trying to get away from putting names on things as well, in terms of putting people in a hole or putting people like, oh, that person's this or that person's that. And really talking about more about what they're experiencing. Because everything is very fluid too, in terms of what people are going through.
Yeah. And I think just to kind of summarize my random tangent is when it says, like, when we say epidemic, it makes it seem like suicide is inevitable. And that's not what I'm saying. Like, I definitely think, as with any mental health issue or with any health issue of a human in your life, we can look and say, oh, look, this is a marker that has me concerned about this person. I'm concerned about you. But it's just like if someone doesn't take their psychotropic medication, is that your fault then if they, like if someone is bipolar and then they're off on a manic episode? I just think there are things that we can do to help support the people that we love, but with anything that is ultimately their choice on the way that they're going to manage their health.
Yeah.
And so I don't think there are as many like tips on like, here's how to help someone who's diabetic in your family.
Right.
Here's how to help your mom with cancer. I don't know. It's like with mental health, it's like we want to give these tips.
Yeah.
And it's like, I'm sorry, you're not an expert. Am I telling you how to manage your spouse's bad back? I don't know. Right.
Well, also, I think it's probably something that, would you think in some ways, the reason why it's a bit of a black box is because when that person commits that act, you don't know what they were thinking in their final moments. Like nobody knows.
Commit. I think you meant to say when they lose their lives.
I'm sorry. When they go through that process, like it's difficult. So like our world is full of these, like what works, what doesn't. And in this area, what you're saying is we really don't know what specifically works. There's no recipe for preventing this because we don't know when that occurs.
We're all
like
unicorns. We're all unicorns.
Yeah.
And I think it's because I see the survivor, they've created a narrative for themselves, right? The survivor has, what is it? Hindsight's 2020, right? And so they're like, oh my gosh, now I'm looking back and seeing they did this and this, and I did that all wrong. And I should have done this. Like there's just the grief for a survivor of suicide is so very different than the grief of other losses. And so it's a very, very incredibly, to me, nuanced and complicated and layered situation that's so very specific for each person. But I think like I would like it to be Suicide Awareness Month and not Suicide Prevention Month, right? Like, and just being able to say, hey, in Suicide Awareness Month, we want to give you some, like we talked about some myths out there, and like it's safe to talk about suicide and to ask people these questions. And these are some myths, but instead of being like, these are the 4 ways to help prevent suicide, that just irks me for what reason. I don't know.
Because as a society, we are expecting there to be a diagnosis and a solution. And so as a survivor, those who have, you're saying, expected to have known how it could have been prevented. And so instead of
control thing.
Yeah,
like we go back to 4,000 weeks. It's too horrifying to think we don't have any control. So I'm going to create this illusion for you on a checklist. So you feel better about it and have some control.
But what you find now in your field is that checklist even makes it harder, because then everyone's like, oh, I didn't look at those items on the checklist. Therefore it's my fault.
Yeah, exactly. And I think it's not, and the people I see aren't necessarily, it wasn't, I mean, it's like 50-50 on whether they knew the person was experiencing mental health issues and thinking about dying by suicide. But for some people, it was 100% total shock. It was just something that happened. No one had any idea.
It's crazy.
How's that? How are you going to wrap your brain around that? Because I think like, and I know we talked about it, but it's like either way, like people tell themselves if they would have left a note, I'd have closure. And then other people are like, oh, I wish it would have just happened fast and I didn't know, So it's like,
there's no easy way to navigate it.
It just sucks. It sucks no matter what. Right.
And I like what you said though, Jess. I mean, just in summary of this, where making an awareness is creating a safe place, right, to talk about it.
Yeah.
Even with our own kids, about like this stuff happens. These people do these things or whatever, and not putting a lot of necessary. I think that's where there's such a negative stigma around having a loss. related to suicide versus other.
Well, we're raised Catholic. They said you go straight to
It's
hell.
the ultimate, yeah, like it's the
You go straight
ultimate
to hell. It's like
selfish, yeah.
the worst, most selfish thing in
Yeah,
history.
thanks a lot, Catholic Church. Yeah, I know. So that's part of the shame around it is it's like,
out there.
ooh, yeah.
Yeah, no kidding. And I think it's more like with my kids, my kids have all said things like, I'm going to kill myself when they're in a mood. Then we have a talk about it, right? Is that how you feel? Because if that's how you're feeling, these are the steps we need to take, and I think in my practice, that's just something you do very first session. Have you had thoughts in the past 30 days about killing yourself? Have you had thought about dying or wish you could fall asleep and not wake up? I mean, just to have those questions, because to me, for the most part, we're talking about it being like a symptom, right? Facing suicide is a symptom of an overall struggle that person is having. And so how can we get that person to a place or to people that will help them discover and uncover the underlying issue?
And that's, I mean, I think,
but again, you can drop someone off at a doctor appointment. You can't shove medication down their throat. I mean,
yeah.
If we don't look at mental health like we do physical health here, right? I think, and so when we talk about shame and stigma, it's because it's like we think it's like a personal choice or control, right? Get it together. Why are you anxious? Why are you depressed? Get up and go do something. But you wouldn't do that if you had cancer, right? You wouldn't be like, take away your cancer, get up, go. And I just think that it's interlocked with that.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
So, I mean, you survived the episode, Kelly. Are you
did.
Okay? Are you hot?
Okay.
Are you sweaty? Are you all right?
Heavy, Jess.
Yeah.
I'm going to have to
I'm
go
kind of
like
angry. I've got to go
stare at the sun.
some square breathing. Something, I don't know. Got to go change our energy.
You can
right?
go run around with your puppies. At least you have a puppy to snuggle.
I got to go take my puppy out. He's very crazy. Kelly, what are you going to do to bring joy for you today?
I'll get back to you.
Did you exercise today?
No, I will exercise. I've been sitting outside working because I have a covered patio and it's been really beautiful out. And I can't believe how productive I was yesterday, just working, but working while I was outside. I don't know. It feels better than just being inside. I need sunshine and I love being outdoors. That brings me a lot of joy.
Bumblebees do not bring me joy. And I remember I had a talk with you one day. I'm going to go sit outside. And there was like a bumblebee the size of a hummingbird. And I was like, never mind. I don't want to be outside.
Swatting at it and freaking out.
I don't swat at it. I'm not like kill the bugs. I'm just, because I'm outside. I feel like that's their territory, but I also don't want them to. I've been stung by bees and bumblebees, I think an inappropriate amount compared to other people.
Beckett has been as well. So he's afraid of them.
And I've like this summer, I was like, I'm not going to be crazy. They come in the pool, they get water. I'm not going to be crazy. I'm going to let them fly and this is like, I'm going to be super chill. And Mom and I were in the pool and I was floating on a pool noodle and I was like, ow, that hurt really bad. And I look over and there's a bee floating in the pool and I was just stung. Like I wasn't doing anything. And I was like, really? But I'm not freaked out. I'm not angry. But I'm just saying, if there was like a swarm of bees, I would probably try to remove myself and immediately I wouldn't get an exterminator, but you would see like, wow, she's a fast sprinter. She can really book it for 44. Anyways, so I get it back. I don't know. We're delicious. We're flowery. We're so beautiful. Becca and I must look like flowers.
That's probably it.
I thought so. All right. Well, thank you for listening. I hope we brought the mood up a little bit for you here at the end.
Yes. Thanks for listening today. Don't forget to subscribe so you can hear our latest episodes as soon as they drop.
And if you love today's episode, leave a review. We'd love to hear from you.